welcome back to another show, another day in another Johnnie To video. This time I'm covering two films, but mainly one. I'll briefly cover three later on, but mainly some Mad Detective. Mad Detective is wonderfully crazy, wonderfully insane, and very difficult to hold off. I mean, I found it very hard to find Mad Detective. I'm trying to look for my copy here. I can't see where I put it. But Mad Detective is a very difficult film to find. I found it in DVD, in a cheap ex-rental copy. But it used to be in Eureka, but they sold out, and now it goes for crazy money. So let's hope that Criterion releases it at some point, because it deserves a Criterion release. It deserves releases from anywhere. They'll release it so you can see it at a decent price, because Mad Detective is one of Johnnie To's most interesting films of what I've seen. And it really takes the kind of crazy, eccentric detective of the Sherlock Holmes types and pushes it into like psychopathic extremes and just pure craziness, and into the realm of like crazy feelings and almost ghostly feelings, and which could just be really good observation that's been expressed in other ways. Because I mean, they play it as if it's something supernatural, but then they'll always come back and say, no, that's not, he's just crazy. And more and more you find out the detective realize how crazy he actually is. But there was a logic within his craziness to actually show you he's actually making some progress. So, I'll start at the beginning. Because trying to describe this film is going to be impossible. Right, so a Mad Detective is a guy who has really strange methods of finding things out. Like, at the beginning he's trying to work out a case, and he ends up putting himself in a suitcase and rolling down some stairs, and the cop that does it with him is just on secondment to him. During this case it gets solved. Then years later, the guy's another case they can't solve, but missing cop. They can't figure out where his gun is. And Johnnie To has quite a few films where we're finding one gun is really important. And this one they try to find a gun and try to find a cop, and they can't figure out what happened. Like the cop went chasing after a suspect, he disappeared, his partner couldn't see where he went. And his partner's been harassed ever since. And they can't get anywhere, and this detective's trying as he might, he cannot figure out how to solve this case. So he ends up going to see the Mad Detective. And basically, he gets more than he planned for. Because he thought he was going to get an eccentric detective who he had to put up with a little bit. A guy who left the force. But I figured if we brought him back a little bit and just got some couple of clues from him, he could solve the case, because he's going mad, try to figure this out. He can't figure it out. So he brings a Mad Detective onto the case, and just all hell breaks loose. And basically by the end of it, it's like, he should have bothered. He should have left and said, we can't solve it. But his ego and his drive to succeed is always there. And it's the thing that pushes everything forward, it pushes the tragedy forward. So, I mean, most of what happens is the fault of the cop who's investigating it. It shows the kind of immaturity and weirdness of an investigation. Maybe should be left alone. And the idea that sometimes people are obsessed with things, obsessed with for unnatural reasons and crazy reasons that just don't do anything good for anybody. So our Mad Detective is brought on board, and one of the things he does is he actually starts to, as he gets to know someone, he starts to see them almost as what's their inner essence. Like he starts to see like the cop he's helping is a child, a small scared child. He sees a target, the cop whose partner disappeared, as a multiple personality with 6 or 7 different personalities all focusing on him. The idea is this could happen because one personality took over. Now it's not literal, it's a metaphor for the different drives, it's focusing a person forward. And he's following this to try to work out what happened. There's all these weird methods that just don't make sense, but make a weird sort of sense. And there's lots of things that happen that I'm not even going to try and explain. You just have to see the film. You really have to see the film, because everything goes to hell. As you probably saw from the image I just put on behind me just before. But I'm not going to explain that either. But yeah, there's the detective goes and does some weird things. You think he's married, it turns out his wife's left him, but he's still imagining her and talking to her, and she's telling him, don't do the case, it'll kill you. And so that's obviously his mind telling him, don't do this, you're too far gone. And the idea of his wife, his imaginary wife's almost like his anchor, telling him, don't do all this stuff. It's almost telling him that he's sick and he needs to take his medication and he has to make himself better. Then you see his actual wife, and she's very different from the fantasy wife. She's much more no-nonsense. And probably was too cynical for him. But he sees her in a much more idealistic fashion in his head, and it's like, it shows you the weird duality of himself, like how he can't face reality. There's all these images and all these things in his head, and he can't quite process it the way humanity needs to process it to be a functioning person. And it's just this how this guy actually tries to function. So all the imagery you see and all these weird imagination things, it's almost a metaphor for how his brain functions. But you've seen the way he sees it, so you have to interpret it, what it actually means logically, or does it mean anything logically, or is it a kind of codes within his own brain to lead him to the proper direction? And as the film goes on, the detective starts to get really frustrated with him. And the guy that investigates is really frustrated because this detective is starting to put things together that people suspected, but it's trying to find the evidence. And it becomes, the more and more they go on, the more I get a sense of everyone just wants this case to just die away. No one wants this solved. No one wants this to be brought up. It's like it's like a kind of one of those kind of creepy kind of messes that it's like, okay, we know this guy's suspect, so we won't promote him or anything, but we don't have enough proof to arrest him. It doesn't matter anyway, who cares? It's just this sense of the corruption within the Hong Kong system that this detective cannot deal with, this mad detective can't deal with. And you've seen him deal with it, you've seen the detective brought him on board deal with it, because he's a much more normal reaction to things. And you've seen the good side, the bad side of normality. The good side is you can logically place things, but the bad side is you might logically place things into corruption as you try and survive a system that isn't very helpful to people. Now, this is all the metaphor that I'm going around, this idea of what things mean, what they don't mean. But this is a Johnnie To film, and it all looks great, and there's a really wonderful sense of humour throughout it. No matter how dark it gets, there is funny in here, because the mad detective knows he's mad. He knows he's very fragile, and there's a lot of emotion below the surface, and there's lots of wonderful things going on all the way through the film. It's just a wonderful film. It's so well directed, and there's so many weird incidents that are fascinating to try and interpret what they mean. And lots of interesting reactions. It's like taking this character, what would be an eccentric character, and it's like, how eccentric can you push this and still be with them? Because this goes far beyond what you'd have in a Sherlock Holmes story, or any other story of an eccentric detective. This is borderline, he should be arrested. Then it goes into beyond the borderline. It's just great. It's just weird and strange, but it's also very moving. It's all about how terrifying madness actually is, and how the function of madness can destroy someone. And it's like, what responsibility do you have to people who are mad to help them or hinder them? Or because this guy's been abandoned by everybody, or then he's been used by people. And then as the film goes on, you start to see how the various ways he gets used and abused, and the various ways he uses and abuses himself to try and get an obsession. He can't quite figure out why he's obsessed by. He's just always trying to solve puzzles in his head. He can't solve the puzzle of what's going on in his own head, and it all becomes a story about the character. But the plot doesn't matter as much. The plot's really about the various flaws in these different characters who are orbiting around each other. That's the plot. The gun doesn't matter ultimately. It's about these 3 or 4 characters and how they interact and how they're important to each other, and how difficult it is surviving in this system they're in. Because every system has its flaws and has its corruptions, and it's like, how do you survive that? And with Mad Detective, he's almost the pure version of everyone who can't survive it. Now, then you see other people who can survive it, and it becomes this story about that, but it's also a Johnnie To film with lots of funny moments, lots of dark humour. I'm trying to go around certain things that happen so that I'm not, like, if you haven't seen it, you're not going to get it, but like, oh, you should have told me that. I'm trying to be kind of talk about it without talking about it in specifics of plot, but because this image is for the first 10 minutes of the film. It's just a wonderful film. It's just really hard to see. It is just one of Johnnie To's best films. Made in the period where he was knocking out the Excelled and election films, where he really was at his peak. So this is just wonderful, and I highly recommend it. Now we're going to 3, which is another Johnnie To film. This is going to be a brief one. This is not as good as Mad Detective. This was made in 2016. Stars Louis Koo, who's been quite a lot of this guy's Johnnie To's films, and he's a very good actor. And this is a really silly film. This is not on the same level of what's some of the other films. But I'm not sure how seriously they were taking the film in the first place, to be honest, so I can't really complain too much. Because the idea of... It's basically a film set in a hospital, and it takes place mostly in the hospital as a detective in the beginning is involved with a shootout, and they bring the suspect into the hospital. He needs a brain operation to get a bullet out of his head. So they have this problem, basically. Like, this guy refuses to have the operation. They suspect there's people around trying to get him out. And it becomes a cat and mouse game. And like, what the detective and his people do, because they're obviously corrupt in some way. The doctor who did the operations had a bad few operations that haven't worked, and she's overworked and overstressed, and she's been irrational. And the crook's just crazy. The crook's just mad. He loves torturing people and causing havoc. And it's one of those things. It's a good setup, but the payoff doesn't really work, and nothing quite makes sense when you think about it. It's like one of those ones like, well, how did the guy get the operation, get the bullet out of his head if he's taken out of the hospital? He's going to die. What's the point of getting him in the first place? And there's all these things in the film that makes you think they weren't taking it that seriously. They were having fun. Then the final third happens, and it basically becomes a massacre. Where all the applauding and all the careful investigation, and you have a cat and mouse game between Louis Koo, the detective, and the criminal, and him dealing with his hospital staff. It's a very kind of low-key, paranoid film for 2/3 of the film. It's fun, it's a bit absurd, but it's enjoyable kind of thing that of a director making a kind of less classy film but having some fun with it, and the idea of a thriller in the hospital. That's all good. But the script doesn't quite deliver, in a sense that you don't quite know what the guy's master plan is until he doesn't have one. And the final third becomes a massacre. And that's what's fun, because after all the applauding about, the final third becomes this absolute insane massacre in this hospital ward. Where they go full John Woo, everybody's getting shot all over the place. It becomes more and more absurd, with the villains hanging off this thing and pulled up by the hero and the doctor, and it's really silly, and it's like it's almost as if everyone took cocaine in the last third of the movie, and just like, what the hell can we do? Yeah, just do everything we've got, because there's no plot element at the end that justifies any of this. We don't have an ending, let's kill everybody. That's what the film is. It's wonderfully absurd. It's like the director's been all over the top. It's like, oh hell, well, let's just go crazy and hope no one will notice that we didn't actually have an ending. So it's a fun movie, but it's a movie by a director who's well above the material. It's almost everyone knows in this film they don't have an ending. They've got a funny setup, but there's no conclusion to the story. And it's like, well, what did we do with this? We just shoot everybody. But it's not a fun film, but it's probably the weakest Johnnie To film I've seen. And mainly, he didn't have to do the script. The script was written by someone else, and I think he was brought in, and he did his best. He brought in good actors, he directed everything well, but there was a massive script problems, and he couldn't really solve that. But it's still an enjoyable bit of trash. But it's like, it's not the film you start with for Johnnie To. It's one of the ones you watch when you've seen so many other good ones to know that, yeah, sometimes he's not so good. Sometimes if he gets a bad script, there's only so much you can do with it. But it's still a lot of fun. I saw it in it was Amazon. I saw it on Amazon Prime. So it's available there just now in the UK. But who knows, it will be there for very much longer. So, but I would recommend watching it for good fun. But that's about it. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back later with some more. Right, bye for now.